Hello and welcome to this week's Liverpool.com podcast. It's Dan Morgan, James Martin and Joel Rabinovitz, where we are going to celebrate 10 years of Jordan Henderson, Liverpool's captain since 2014. He took the armband from Steven Gerrard and has since won at the Premier League, the UEFA Champions League, the FIFA Club World Cup, UEFA Super Cup, and hopefully many more to come. To discuss Jordan Henderson, we want to sort of give the whole show to him over the course of the next however long we're here. We're going to discuss his journey. We're going to discuss the bumps in the road, of which he's had many, and we're going to discuss what's still to come as he enters the age of 31 as Liverpool captain. We hope a lot more. We hope a lot more success. But for now, I'm going to start with the journey at its very beginning, and I have to caveat this by saying I'm on a call with a 23 and 24-year-old who have a lot more years on me, and so I might be the one carrying this particular element of the show a little bit. But Joel, give me your thoughts as early as you can, as vivid as you can, from when Henderson signed, and you know, with I suppose with a degree of hindsight attached now, what you think perceptions were around him around the time he came into the club.
Yeah, I mean, this will make you feel even older, but I was back at school when we signed him, and this was in the days when Twitter probably had started, but I wasn't on Twitter. Transfers weren't the all sort of 24/7 coverage that you get now, where you can see rumours left, right and centre. So it wasn't something that you were sort of tracking in the way that we sort of tend to know who clubs are following at the moment. Obviously Liverpool tend to keep most of their stuff kind of under wraps, but you tend to have a pretty good idea of what kind of players most clubs are looking for. And back then that wasn't really the case so much. So from my perspective, it was one that it came out of the blue a little bit. I think he had 2 seasons in the Premier League at Sunderland. His reputation was good at the time, but it wasn't like kind of a current crop of English players like Mount, Foden, players like that coming through who really are kind of dubbed as the next superstars. He was kind of a player who was promising, but nobody knew quite how good he would be. I think I was having a look at his numbers earlier in the season before. He played almost every game. I think it was 37 appearances for Sunderland. And he got something like 3 goals and 4 assists, playing kind of mostly right-hand side of midfield and a bit in the centre as well. So nothing there that sort of screams out like as an incredible record at that point. But yeah, I think sort of in hindsight, what was interesting about that summer is he comes as part of that package of players who most of them were kind of abject failures, really. Charlie Adam, Stuart Downing, and Henderson sort of becomes sort of associated with that crop of signings. And it takes quite a while, I think. Obviously, as I'm sure we'll come on to discuss, it takes him a while to really kind of find himself at Liverpool. But I think a lot of the perception of him in the early years was tied to the kind of the players he joined alongside and how they kind of ended up faring at the club. And I think it took a while for him to become separated from that and to realise that he wasn't just one of this big amalgamation of poor signings that summer. But yeah, as we'll come on to say, it took a while to really see that version of Henderson.
I remember there being quite a wince collectively over the fee. James, I remember 20 million being seen as excessive. And I think it was to do with, Joel touches on his sort of early style, if you like, and the early perception of him as a player. He wasn't seen in the Mount mode as we see these days. He wasn't seen as sort of the hyper-creative midfielder. He was seen as very sort of workmanlike, but in a positive sense. And I think from a very early stage, you could see his leadership qualities. And I think, therefore, Liverpool fans were happy with signing him, but I think there was an uncertainty about what type of player, A, he was, and B, he would become. And I think the fear around that time was something which it sort of made you, I think it gave us a little bit of a hint of where FSG, in terms of transfers and investments, wanted their priorities to be.
Yeah, I mean, I should probably preface this by saying that it was the age where I was just excited and hugely enthusiastic about any Liverpool signing, simpler times. So with that whole crop that Joel mentioned, I was convinced they'd all go on to be Liverpool legends, But
I made a big play for Downing. I made a really big play for Downing, which I don't look back on fondly now.
But yeah, no, you're definitely right to bring up the fee in that regard. It did seem a lot, although I suppose you would also mention there was the January before when there was Carroll coming in for even bigger money, I suppose. So, but yeah, particularly when you're not necessarily looking at a Henderson and thinking, okay, this is the role he fulfills, this is what he brings to the team. It did seem like a big outlay, and yeah, I suppose it was a kind of an early indicator of the FSG strategy, that kind of picking up these players who, I mean, he was at a Premier League club, he was well known, but he wasn't necessarily a superstar, and it was one where they've just had to look at it and thought, okay, this is someone who there's underlying talent there which we can do something with. Well, obviously we didn't know how it was going to pan out at the time because it was under totally different management to who he's sort of flourished under now. But that idea of investing in the youth and hoping that they will develop at the club rather than necessarily going for the pre-established massive names, if you like.
I think so. Part of what was confusing a little bit, I suppose, about the signing at the time, or what's interesting looking back now, is that it's quite rare now, I feel, to see players who you would describe as wide midfielders as such. They tend to either be sort of a midfield three player, a centre mid, or a front three sort of wide forward. And Henderson was in that kind of strange. He was mostly a right-sided wide midfielder, but you wouldn't describe him as a winger in the sense that we describe sort of wide forwards now. So he was kind of like an in-between sort of player, also arriving at Liverpool at the time when we didn't really know what the club was meant to be in terms of their aspirations, if we were going to challenge for top four trophies. It was a kind of strange transitional period, and he was one of those players who you felt could go either way, but you weren't kind of 100% confident at the time that he would eventually justify that fee, which I think it was, some reports say 16 million, some 20, but back then that was kind of really big money for a player of that age and kind of relatively little pedigree as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, the sort of mix match he comes into. He's bought with the likes of, you say, Charlie Adam, Downing, Jose Enrique. There's Andy Carroll and Luis Suarez just a few months before. It's really sort of a transition in Liverpool. But I remember him being the one where you thought, okay, this is where the strategy is. And Damien Comolli is there at that time, and he's since tried to take a lot of credit for Jordan Henderson's signing in that sense. But I think Joel, it's understandable then that when he comes into the team that he takes a while to get going. He takes a while to find any kind of form and rhythm. And I think you sort of forget with these young players around that time, they're coming into such a mammoth football club, such a huge concept. In the documentary that's been released with his dad, there's the chat around, like he says he was in Melwood and Carragher and Gerrard are around, and the sheer sort of impact it would have had on him, just changing from, with all due respect, Sunderland to a club like Liverpool, and the subconscious responsibilities which come with that. For a player who we now know drives the very sort of best standards out of himself, you can see in the early days that it sort of weighted on him, didn't it?
Definitely, I think it was a huge leap for him to take kind of that early in his career. And I think what made it even harder to kind of compare to now, whenever Liverpool buy a player now, however old they are, it's really obvious what the purpose is or where they're going to fit into the team, in the system, because all that stuff is so well established. So we bought Konate as the first signing this summer in his early 20s, and he's obviously going to be playing centre back, but we've got a very clearly defined set of kind of things that we expect from a Liverpool defender under Klopp in the system that we play. It will be the same if they sign a front three player this summer as it was with Jota, and the same if they buy a midfielder. We know how the system works, and back then, like you said, it was all kind of, it all felt a bit mix and match. And I think that meant that Henderson, when he was coming in, didn't really know what he was meant to be. I don't think Dalglish necessarily knew what Henderson's best role was going to be long term, and so he had to kind of carve his own path, I suppose, which which made it a lot more difficult. He wasn't just being slotted into a system that was working all really well. Liverpool did have some good players at the time, but it was all kind of, it felt very, very changeable, I think, kind of from game to game. And I think that in terms of him sort of feeling a little bit lost, I suppose, a little bit struggling to find his niche, I suppose, in the team, I think that made it a lot harder for him in the sort of first 12 to 18 months. And it's only really, I think, when you get to kind of the second half of the 12-13 season and the Rodgers, when he really starts to kind of bed in, he starts playing centrally a lot more often, and you see sort of Henderson grow into the shirt. But I think definitely the first season, but I'd also bring that into kind of the start of Rodgers as well. He's a young player who's not only, like you said, struggling with the increase in expectations that comes with playing for Liverpool, but also not entirely sure where he belongs in the whole thing.
Yeah, I think, as far as people trying to take credit for Henderson, which they have, a reference Comolli, James, there's been times when Brendan Rodgers has alluded to sort of his part in Henderson's development and journey, and rightly so. But I think Kenny does deserve credit. He plays quite a lot on the right, and you would ordinarily look at him now and say, well, an orthodox sort of right midfielder, which he was under Dalglish in those early days, it wouldn't suit the player he is. But I think what's present with Kenny is the sense that he needs to get him games, and the sense that he needs to get him on the pitch. And what's actually going to be detrimental to him is if he's not playing and he's in his own head. And Dalglish finding a way to get him on the pitch, I think, was massive for him in those early days, even to where he struggles a little bit, and even to go through, the sort of acid test that Anfield can be for a home player sometimes. And the other things he's mentioned since, like Luis Suarez giving him a hard time in training, and stuff like that, which was very interesting when he opens up on it. But you find he's going through all of this attrition, and there's a reason for it, and ultimately you start to see it sort of blossom later on. But I think Dalglish deserves credit for how he handled Henderson.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, like you say, all of the struggles he was having, they would have been amplified 10 times if that was all going on without even getting the game time, because he's that kind of player where if he's on the pitch, he's not going to hide on the pitch, even with all of these doubts going through his head. So, yeah, if it's so important for his development that he gets those early minutes under Kenny, like you say. Has it shaped that much of what he's become today? Possibly stylistically not that much, because like you say, some of it was off the right, and how that Liverpool team played compared to how it plays now is worlds apart. But yeah, the very fact that he was on the pitch and just almost getting used to, like you say, the expectations, the Anfield crowd, all of those things, they're intangibles on their own, but they do add up to shape the player that we see today, I think. And yeah, credit to Dalglish for that.
Just come back to you. We sort of move forward. He's present, and he takes on a bit of a different identity in Rodgers' first season. He almost, I remember sort of feeling like he'd become this kind of box to box midfielder who could just carry out a sort of third man run and get on the end of things, which were really sort of energetic and marauding, and he had bags of energy, and I think that's where you sort of seen his identity develop in that second season. But then at the end of that season, there is the possibility of him leaving Liverpool in a swap deal for Clint Dempsey. Brendan Rodgers would have allowed that to happen. He offered Henderson the chance for that to happen, and he's open about the fact of how much it upset him, how much he made it clear he wanted to stay at Liverpool and fight for his place. And I think that's often, it's not overlooked, but I think the impact of it can be, that to face those, those sort of self-fulfilling prophecies that you're telling yourself that you might not be good enough for Liverpool, that you might get moved on, that players do. Jamie Carragher says for years that every time Liverpool bought a defender, he thought it was to replace him. That's what a footballer is. It's what he becomes by his very nature, paranoid to keep his career in the best trajectory he can. I guess where I'm going with this is, that for a young man who wanted his career to be the very best it could be at Liverpool Football Club, it was a lot to deal with and it showed a lot of adversity for him to A, want to stay, and B, come back from it.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's a reason why he's now the captain of this team that's, been labelled by Klopp the mentality monsters. He sort of embodies that, and we saw that from very early on. Like you say, it would have been such an easy option to do, just to bin it off at that stage. The manager's not showing great deals of faith. He's, saying, I'd rather have Clint Dempsey in there, which isn't exactly a vote of confidence. No disrespect to Dempsey, but yeah. The fact that he was already in that kind of headspace, if you like, where he knows what he wants, he knows that he wants to build this kind of legacy and is determined to fight for that. Yeah, it says it all about the player and the man.
Yeah, I mean, full disrespect to Dempsey on my part, Joel. Life would have been very different, and the benefit of hindsight now means we can question this, but I mean, at the time, there was a lot of people championing that deal and wanting it to happen. And rightly, because Liverpool needed another forward. They were massively short on forward options. But, I mean, the reverberation for the club in the last decade, should that deal have gone through, it would have been huge.
I remember thinking the timing of it was really strange, because that second half of that 12-13 season under Rodgers was when Henderson really started to kind of come to the fore. And there's a few games that really stick out in my mind that I really kind of first saw that there's a player really worth keeping here that's going to kind of go on to do things. And he scores that goal, Aston Villa away, I think it was, around I think it was January, February time. Coutinho plays a lovely through ball in behind, and that's one of those kind of rampaging forward runs that you mentioned, and it's a lovely kind of dinked finish. I think it ends up being the winner in that match, actually. Liverpool win 2-1 that day. And then there's the one, I think it's either the penultimate game or the third last game of the season, when they go to Newcastle and win 6-0, and Sturridge is unplayable, but Henderson as well. You really start to see the kind of nucleus of that team that goes on to do what they do in 13-14 of Henderson, Sturridge, Coutinho. And Henderson, he scores twice that day. There's one when he's on the break with Sturridge, and it's a tap in that Sturridge lays across, and then he scores a free kick which sort of bends in at the far post. And I think he gets an assist as well for Sturridge in that game. And that's when you really start to see, I think, kind of Henderson feeling like he belongs at Liverpool. And that's why when you get to the end of that season, he's probably still only 23, maybe 24 at that point. And the idea that you would sell him, I don't know how old Dempsey was, but he was probably in his kind of late 20s at that point.
Yeah, he was.
It just felt really strange. And the message that would have sent to Henderson, kind of given his progress that he'd made in the months beforehand, that, that's still not enough and we don't see a role for you, I think would have been a really hard blow for him to sort of come back from. And yeah, it shows an awful lot of mental resolve to just refuse, basically, and say that he's put too much in to get to that point in his career and he's not going to give it up that easily. And as it goes on to show, in 2013-14, he becomes one of the key parts of that team, which goes so close to winning the league. And I'm not quite sure at which point Rodgers kind of realises his own error of judgment, but it's pretty quickly into that 13-14 season that Henderson becomes pretty much irreplaceable, which obviously kind of towards the end of that season, when he does miss out those few games, you really see the impact of him when he's taken out the team.
Yeah, I think, Joel, bringing 13-14 into the equation, I think what's clear about him and what's being clear about him for the majority of his career is he gets better around better players.
Yeah. And
I think that you see he finds his identity more the more competent Liverpool become under Rodgers, and the more sort of, I'd say, tactically rigid they become, more tactically advanced they become. I think he's very quickly someone you see who understands the game, and when he's around people who A, have ability and B, have a similar understanding, then I think that's where in those snippets of 13-14, I think he started to see his leadership credentials come through, because I think there's a part of him where he feels like, okay, I'm at home, I can play in this team around good players, but also what are my strengths? Okay, I can lead, I can keep us tactically solid, I can make sure that we're switched on, I can do all of these other things, which, Steven Gerrard will do, but eventually and very soon, he won't be here to do. So I think there's a part of him that sees that opportunity to just take a step up, and he massively takes it in 13-14.
Yeah, he does. Before we came on this, I knew we were doing the Henderson podcast. I was watching back. Liverpool posted on their YouTube this morning a video of all his assists over his 10 years. I think there's 49 of them in the end, which is pretty impressive. But what really stands out, especially sort of in those early sort of years, really, is that he has an unbelievable partnership with Suarez. And it's something that doesn't really get spoken about that much, because you always hear Sturridge and Suarez. Everyone talks about the Gerrard-Torres partnership under Benitez, and obviously the front three that we have now under Klopp. But the Henderson-Suarez sort of connection, I've never really kind of got mentioned that much. But you see how many goals Henderson ends up setting up for Suarez back then, and then the movement that he makes and how those two kind of worked in tandem. Really impressive. And yeah, that's something which begins sort of in the 12-13 season and carries on into 13-14. And yeah, I remember the Spurs away game actually is one that really stands out in that 13-14 season, when I think Liverpool go there with a few players missing. I think Gerrard's not in the team that day. I think Liverpool's midfield is actually Henderson, Lucas and Allen, if I'm right. And they win 5-0. Suarez is incredible. But Henderson sets up the opening goal. I think he kind of pinches the ball back on the edge of the box, pokes it to Suarez. He dummies a couple of defenders and slots it in. And then Henderson makes it 2-0 with a great sort of volleyed finish. And Liverpool just run rampage thereafter. But in terms of what you're saying there, him stepping up as a leader in the team, I think without Gerrard that day, I think there was no Sturridge as well. That was one where you really saw him and Suarez together really kind of lead Liverpool in a way that you hadn't seen so much before. And that's something which kind of throughout the rest of 13-14 and definitely moving into the season thereafter, when he starts to actually captain Liverpool quite regularly, because Gerrard's sort of in and out of the team, is something that really builds from there.
Yeah, I think he's yet to fully open up, James, on the concept of taking over from Gerrard, and I think it's something that we'll probably hear from him later on in his career, maybe when he retires. But that it's been referenced many times that responsibility of anyone at the time who was taking that armband was going to be, it was seen as being irreplaceable. It was seen as being impossible in terms of the legacy that they were following. I think as a captain, I think what's most important to reference is the fact that he's very much become his own captain, and he's very much done things his own way. And I think it would have been very, very easy for him and anyone to try and replicate Gerrard. And Gerrard was, a player of his generation. He remains the greatest Liverpool player I've ever seen. But what I mean is, that Gerrard was very, very, very set through his ability of leading by doing, and leading by example of his football ability. And Henderson could have tried to be his own version of that. Now, Henderson, for me, I think the manner in which he takes on the concept of captaincy in all manner of ways, not just on the pitch, but off it, in those early days especially, I think he deserves huge credit. And I think, the team he takes over as captain is a very uncertain one, and it's a very, it's one that's not long for this world, to be honest. When you look at that squad, some of the players in there, some of the state of transition it's in, and the state and the need for it to gain some kind of stability and identity. I think A, walks into a really difficult situation, and B, I think very quickly decides he needs to put his own stamp on the captaincy.
Yeah, I think it's true that it was always going to be something of an impossible task to take over from Gerrard, but the fact that he almost hasn't tried to take over is like you say, the key point there. He's made the role his own. It's not like Gerrard's left and then the very next game Henderson's steaming forward trying to score 30-yarders all the time just because he feels like he has to, and that could have been really sort of damaging to the team, to his own development. But yeah, instead he takes it all in his stride, so level-headed with it, and becomes less of that leader by example and more just by his vocalness on the pitch, his example off the pitch as well. To be fair, he does lead by example in that regard with, his charity work we've seen recently, everything like that, just embodying the values of a club in different ways to how Gerrard would have done it. But
Well, there's the thing, isn't it, around, sorry, there's the thing
No,
around where a couple of the players have said he's taking on their media duties and stuff. And even that, it's little and it's minuscule, but it shows that he wants to protect his players. He sees a responsibility. He wants to be a leader.
Yeah, I mean, everything he does is for the benefit of the club on and off the pitch, and that is the highest praise you can give him. So, I mean, even if you look at how his role has evolved now, and this is also kind of harking back to his earlier days at Liverpool, it's quite an interesting one because now he's perfectly happy to fill in that midfield role where a lot of the time he'll almost be auxiliary right back as Trent bombs forward. Whereas some captains might say, you know what, I'm club captain. I'm not going to be sitting back covering for our attacking fullback. I want to be more involved in the attack, whatever. But he's happy to fulfill that role, and he's also been prepared for that role by going all the way back to Kenny when he was that kind of right-sided figure. He has that experience to fall back on, and then equally in Rodgers' diamond, with no actual wide players in that per se, he has that experience of having to cover the width while also being notionally that central midfielder. So yeah, that kind of willingness to just play wherever the manager wants him is it's a captain's quality in its own right.
I think we need to be candid, Joel, and I think we need to be honest that there was a lot of Liverpool fans who didn't rate him, didn't want him captain, didn't want him on the pitch for Liverpool for a long time. And I've been in Anfield for many years. I've argued with people in Anfield over Jordan Henderson up until, I would say, the last one I can remember is West Brom at home, 17-18. So Christmas 2017 was when this narrative was still around for me that he's unproductive, he can only pass sideways, he's not a good player, he's not beneficial to Liverpool. And I don't ever want to sit here and say, I was proved right, or I was championing the right cause, because we can all do that. But I still to this day don't understand how you couldn't see a footballer in Jordan Henderson. And I wonder, like with everything we've referenced, us getting to the point of bringing Jurgen Klopp into Liverpool and seeing a vision and knowing that this was going to be a body of work over a number of years, I think that did allow for a lot of people to see Henderson's value slowly, and to see that his value as a footballer, is of the very, very highest quality. And he was exactly where he should have been playing for Liverpool Football Club over the last 10 years. But B, his responsibility to making Liverpool a successful team again.
Yeah, I mean, I lost count of the amount of times I got into arguments with people about Henderson's worth, like you, specifically the whole thing. I remember there was a point at which that he doesn't pass forwards thing was almost like the Trent can't defend thing that we get told now, which is just, there's no evidence to really back it up at all. You actually watch him on a weekly basis, you'll see that it's nonsense. But it's one of those things that gets perpetuated. Pundits will say it, it will get spoken about online, and people just get it in their heads that he can't do these things. And it just wasn't true. And I always go back to it was a kind of a lost season, really, because we all tried to kind of erase most of it from our memory in 2014-15, seeing kind of that brilliant 13-14 side just disintegrate into nothingness. And it was such a grim time. But actually, in terms of Henderson's Liverpool journey, he was, I would say, up there with Sterling and Coutinho, who obviously performed well that season. He was Liverpool's driving force, really. He comes out the back of that 14-15 season in a really underperforming Liverpool team with 14 assists and 7 goals, playing a combination of central midfield and right wing back, which kind of, whatever you look at in any team, that is really good numbers. And kind of lots of those assists are the kind of ones that you've still seen him done over the years thereafter. It wasn't just a one-off. He's always had a really wide range of passing in his locker. And I do think he's obviously grown as a player under Klopp, but it wasn't as if he didn't have that all along. And I think going back to kind of when Klopp first arrived, it's interesting now looking back. I remember that there was almost even a conversation at the time of whether Klopp would keep him as captain when he comes in. It's obviously taking over the team. Klopp, does he want to put somebody else in charge and stamp his own authority? And one of the very early things he does is say, absolutely not. Henderson is the captain of his team and I'm keeping him there. And the 15-16 season ends up being a bit of a kind of non-entity really for Henderson, because he gets that horrible. Is that when he picks up the plantar fasciitis? I don't know how you pronounce it.
It's when it's all present,
yeah. He's got that heel injury, which is one of those which is horrible because there's no real cure for it. He tries to come back a few times and it's still there, and it's inhibiting him sort of playing his natural game, because he does rely on getting about the pitch so much that when you've got something that basically hurts every time you put pressure on your foot, then it's going to be a problem. And it's a funny one I've written this morning about Henderson's relationship with Klopp really being the thing that took him from a very good player into kind of one of the all-time greats and the legend that he is now. But it took a while really for that to happen because of the injury thing. 16-17, he ends up moving position. Obviously, Klopp starts playing him as a holding midfielder, but then he misses basically the entire run-in through injury in 16-17. And so it actually takes a few years really before Henderson becomes a proper kind of regular part of the Klopp setup and the Klopp team. And I do think his kind of development under Klopp, he would say himself, I think when he gets to the end of his career, Henderson, in terms of his own growth as a player and as a person, I think he owes a huge amount of it to Klopp, because I think that positional change at the start of 16-17 that I referenced, I remember when he started him there against Arsenal the first day of that season, and he's got Lallana and Wijnaldum playing sort of either side of him as a number 8s. It's the first time you really see that sort of three-man Klopp midfield template that has become kind of the recipe for Liverpool's success. And I remember seeing it and thinking, I just can't see Henderson playing as a holding midfielder based on the kind of box-to-box player that we knew. I think it's a credit to Klopp that he recognised that he had those qualities in him, but also Henderson, as James says, his own willingness and open-mindedness to kind of take that challenge on, I think has really kind of made him the player that he is now.
I always remember how much his passing was underrated in those positions. You know, he could rake one 40, 50 yards over the top, but that if it was Xabi Alonso, you know, there'd be video reels of it for days, and there'd be nothing. You know, I'd watch almost 2 or 3 a game of him just putting people in over the top, finding first time switches of play, things that were absolutely elite in his position. And like I say, James, you know, there was a sense that there was this still strange narrative around about his worth to Liverpool and his value as a footballer, which were really weird. I was once offered a fight in the centenary stand by a guy who I'm saying was at least 70, and I declined for no other reason than I didn't fancy it or my chances or prospects. So, all joking aside, it was present, and all the time we're seeing this player emerge, develop under an elite manager who trusts him seemingly with his footballing life.
Yeah, well, I think Joel touched upon it. It's that case of once a narrative forms, it is so hard to shift it. We've seen it with Trent, like you say. We've seen it with all kinds of players. But Henderson was definitely a victim of that. Certainly, I remember vividly that kind of era of the only passes sideways. But I think what you have to remember is if he's doing that, it's because that's what he's been instructed to do. We see it a lot with Klopp. The players come under criticism for not necessarily getting forward enough or what have you, but it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of the kind of function of the midfield under Klopp. And so, yeah, certainly we occasionally saw those kind of Hollywood passes from Henderson, which showcased how good he was. And yeah, they almost certainly were underrated by fans at the time. But the fact that they weren't happening sort of every 10 minutes or so is just purely because he's so good at listening to what the manager wants of him. He doesn't want him to be pinging them around all the time, because that's not what the midfield's necessarily in there to do. The creativity comes from other areas in the team. The midfield is there as that solid base to allow others to push on. And yeah, Henderson understood that before many of the fans did, I think, which hurt perceptions of him.
And just now, James, looking at him now in the modern day, you know, what he means to this football club. This is a team, this is a club, this is a set of supporters, which I say a lot, has gone on a journey together, and they have all contributed their own thing to making this what it is, and it's not over. But when you look back at the journey in its current state, he embodies so much of it. He is pivotal to all of the good that Liverpool have become over the last few years. And, you know, he's given blood, sweat and tears for this club and has done so in a way in which, you know, when we talk at the top of the show about what we thought he could be when he was a young boy coming from Sunderland, in a way in which has almost been corroborated, in that you knew that he would give absolutely everything to succeed. And you knew that no one would work as hard as he would work. And you knew that his standards would drive him. And all of those things have come to fruition, but they've also meant that now you're looking at a winner. You know, you're looking at someone who's lifted trophies. You're looking at someone who will be embedded into Liverpool's history as a great Liverpool captain. And that is, you know, that's some achievement for him in the modern day.
Yeah, I mean, you said it all, really. I mean, that's as good a tribute as you're going to get to him. He's summed up that journey that the team has been on. I think what says a lot is this injury recently that's kept him out for, you know, best part of 3 months on and off. He tried to run it off, and it's just it's just so Henderson. Like he gives absolutely everything and then some, or tries to, just for the sake of the team. And yeah, that kind of mentality is what Klopp has instilled among the whole squad. But yeah, Henderson has had it just naturally since the moment he arrived, and he's been such a big part of helping to spread that mentality throughout. And yeah, like you say, ultimately that's led to him lifting some of the biggest trophies in the game, including the one that Liverpool waited 30 years for. So yeah, I mean, legacies don't get much better than that.
No, you think about the person he's become, Joel. You know, he's an ambassador for so much more now than captain Liverpool Football Club, and that's again a sign of his awareness of his responsibilities, isn't it? Not just for us, but for the position he holds within, you know, the city, the country, the manner in which he has become somebody who has been very forthright about the fact that footballers need to start using their voice for good, and to raise awareness of the things of that they are passionate about and believe are right. You know, he's been right up there with those two, hasn't he?
He has, yeah. I don't know if either of you seen the video that Liverpool put out last night that they'd done with his dad, kind of looking back over his 10 years. But I thought it was interesting at the end that his dad says that he's actually more proud of the person he's become than the footballer he is, which kind of, given what he's achieved on the pitch, is quite the statement. And I think that's fair enough, really. You look at what he's done, it goes so far beyond the boundaries of the sport. With the NHS stuff, last summer, he's obviously recently handed over his social media to kind of tackle online abuse. And he's doing all these kind of, I think the thing about Henderson is he doesn't want any of his praise. And there's kind of been talk that he's made all kinds of donations and done charitable work, and actually has asked people not to make it public because he doesn't want the kind of credit for it. He just wants to kind of do his thing. And I think that really sums him up as a player and a person. And I think kind of, now that we're kind of looking at his legacy, we hope that it will carry on for kind of several years yet, but it's 10 years. It's enough time to kind of look at the player he is and the player he's become. And I think what's an interesting way of looking at it is, for a significant proportion of Liverpool supporters, anyone born sort of, or anyone who started watching football around the kind of mid to late 2000s, by the time Henderson retires or leaves Liverpool, he will probably be the player that most people have watched the most of in their entire lives watching football, which is a crazy thing to think when you think about it. I think for me, I was trying to work this out. I think Gerrard probably is the one at the moment, but if Henderson carries on for another 2 or 3 years, I would have watched more games of him for Liverpool than anyone else in my lifetime. And that might remain the case given his kind of longevity. Trent, maybe in a few years' time, might be in that conversation as well. But his longevity, I think, is remarkable. And I think what's so kind of inspiring about him as a player is that despite all the success he's had and the trophies he's lifted and the moments he's been a part of, he's still unbelievably kind of humble and relatable as a player as well. So whereas Gerrard was kind of this almost superhuman phenomenon figure that people looked up to, I think Henderson's the more kind of one that we can all, everyone who's been through their own struggles in life can see some of that in Henderson, the things that he's had to come through in his career. And his just happened to have been played out in front of millions of people. But he's not someone who's kind of, he's had to work extremely hard, basically, and I think we'd all say that he's squeezed every last drop of his ability out to kind of do the best for Liverpool. And that's probably how I'd sum him up. And yeah, as we said, hopefully there's more of it to come, because I think he's only he's turned 31 this summer. Hopefully the injuries don't prevent him from having a good few years left.
All right, last quick question. When do we next see the Hendo shuffle?
Next season, at the end of next season.
What are we lifting?
Oh, the big question. I think I'm just going to say the league, because I think they'll be so up for it.
Nah, I've decided we're winning the Champions League. The fact that it's meant to have been in Istanbul for the last 2 years and it's kept on being postponed, it's waiting. It's waiting for Liverpool. It's waiting. It
would not surprise me. I'm fully adamant, for my own reasons, that we're doing a league and FA Cup double next season. So whichever one of them come first.
Well, the FA Cup's one of the only things he's got left in his collection. He's pretty much won everything else, so
you can have it. It won't elude him.
Nice.
It won't be a Steven Gerrard Premier League situation. But for now, we'll leave it there. Huge thanks to James and to Joel. That's been this week's Liverpool.com podcast. Take care.